In today's video, we're talking about the US national debt, which has reached a record $34 trillion. It's like someone with a lot of credit card debt who keeps overspending and digging themselves into a deeper hole. This doesn't seem like it's going to end well. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's look at the situation over the years. A century ago, the US national debt was $383 billion. 50 years later, it grew to about $3 trillion. 20 years ago, it hit $12 trillion. 10 years ago, it spiked to $23 trillion. And now we're at $34 trillion. The chart shows it's getting out of control. Now let's address a basic question. Why is the US government in debt? The government spends more money than it earns. To cover the gap, they borrow money and go deeper into debt. The main source of the government's income is individual income taxes, followed by social security taxes. Do you really believe there won't be consequences to all of this? In my opinion, that's wishful thinking. Now let's discuss this further. Besides individual and social security taxes, there are also corporate taxes and other smaller earners like excise taxes, customs, and estate taxes. Here are the numbers for December 2023. Total tax income collected was $429 billion, while total expenditures were $559 billion. That means the US government overspent by $130 billion. Now, let's talk about the fiscal year 2024, which began in October. It's off to a rough start. In December, there was a budget deficit of $130 billion, and November was even worse. Let's clear something up. This isn't about Republicans versus Democrats. Both parties overspend and drive us deeper into debt. George Bush did it, and so did Barack Obama, surpassing Bush. Then came Republican Trump, spending even more than Obama, reaching record debt levels. Now Democrat Biden is spending even more than Trump, setting new records. So, it's not about parties, it's about Congress and politicians as a whole needing to learn how to balance a budget. I get it. I'm a practical person too. I know politicians have to do their thing, make deals, and sometimes it gets a bit slimy, but there should be less of that. In the current situation, it feels like they're really pushing their luck, in my opinion. Now, let's talk about who the US government owes all this money to. Take a look. Some of the debt is owed to foreign countries, marked in light blue on the right side. Japan holds the most US debt, followed by China, the UK, and others. Domestically, the US government owes the most money to the Federal Reserve. The Fed has been lending a lot to the government in recent years, along with mutual funds, pension funds, financial institutions, and wealthy individuals. Let's talk about why this situation is more worrying than ever. The US government pays interest on the money it borrows, and that's getting pretty hefty. By 2033, it's projected that the government will spend more on interest payments than on national defense. This could happen even sooner, maybe in about 5 years. The interest payments will be close to what's spent on Medicare, but that's not all. Another concern is that this growing debt could lead to massive inflation. The Federal Reserve, which lends a lot to the US government, creates money out of thin air, which can cause inflation. So, it's a double worry. Let's break it down logically. The US government is expected to go about $2 trillion more into debt this year because they're planning to overspend by that much. So, they'll add $2 trillion to their debt. Where does that money come from? It's created by the Federal Reserve out of thin air. Now think about it. If the government keeps injecting $2 trillion into the economy every year, what will happen? It's likely to cause massive inflation. And inflation makes wealth inequality worse. The rich tend to benefit more while the poor suffer. And guess what? The Federal Reserve seems poised to start printing money again. They're talking about ending QT and doing QE again, essentially turning on the money printers once more. So, given all this, it's not hard to see why there's concern. It's crucial to understand that a $2 trillion deficit would actually be seen as a good year. Why? Because during a recession, it would be much worse. Much worse. Imagine if the deficit ballooned to $4 trillion or even $5 trillion in just 1 year. That's not far-fetched when you consider the straightforward dynamics of a recession. During a recession, unemployment skyrockets, meaning fewer people are working and contributing to the economy. This, in turn, leads to a significant drop in government revenue and a surge in government spending on things like unemployment benefits and welfare programs. This is why the US government absolutely cannot afford to have a recession. Politicians and the Federal Reserve treat the word recession like it's the ultimate taboo because they understand the dire consequences. If a recession hits, the debt could spiral completely out of control. When fewer people have jobs and earn less money, they pay fewer taxes to the government. This means the government gets less money from taxes. Also, if the stock market does badly, the government gets less money from taxes on profits people make from selling stocks. So, overall, the government gets a lot less money, maybe even $1 trillion less. You can check that. On the other side, the government has to spend more money to help the economy. Last time, they did things like giving out stimulus checks and tax breaks to keep the economy from getting even worse. So, what does all this mean? It means less money coming in for the government, fewer taxes collected, and the government having to spend more money. This leads to bigger deficits. That's why we can't afford a recession. If we have one, this whole thing could unravel even faster. The worst-case scenario is the whole system falling apart. This system is based on trust and people continuing to be a part of it. If people lose faith in the US dollar and the system, everything could collapse. But losing credibility doesn't happen suddenly. It's a gradual process, not like flipping a light switch. Let me sum it up for you. If more and more people, institutions, or countries lose faith in the system, here's what could happen. Let's say the US government wants to borrow money from you. You'd want them to pay you back with interest, maybe 4% a year. Just like if you were borrowing money from someone else, you'd have to pay them back with interest too. So let's say you want 4% interest. But if people start losing faith in the system, they'll think lending to the US government is riskier. In that case, they'll want higher interest rates to make up for that risk, maybe 5%, 6%, 7%, or even 8%. But then the US government might struggle to pay back all that interest. They might need to print more money, which leads to higher inflation. If inflation hits 10% or 15%, investors will want even higher interest rates, like 20%. It becomes a debt spiral. Experts are warning about this. Penn Wharton says the US debt will become unsustainable, and a default might happen within 20 years. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, says there could be a global market rebellion over the US debt. He thinks this debt spiral is the most predictable crisis we've ever faced. But here's some good news. We're probably going to be okay for the rest of this decade. I don't see a system failure happening in 2020s. So, we have time. I'm trying to stay positive about this. Isn't that great news? Well, that's the update. The politicians are leading us toward a cliff. We're $34 trillion in debt. Let me know what you think in the comments.